It's wonderful to be in worship on this day. Happy Father's Day to all of you who are fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers, and who are those people that have mentored and encouraged others who've been like fathers to many. We appreciate you all so much and all that you do. And happy Father's Day to you. And I want to add my thanks to the singing women of First Church. What a great Father's Day gift for us. Beautiful. Well, we're continuing our series of sermons on parables of the realm of God. The realm of God, or the kingdom of God, is whenever and wherever God's will is done. Parables of the realm of God. And so when Jesus taught in parables, he was calling people to live in this realm where God's will is done, to be devoted to the realm of God, to live in it, to be followers of Jesus in living in that realm, to do our part to make the realm of God present on earth as God establishes that realm. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, Jesus taught his disciples to pray. And so he pointed us and called us to the realm of God. And this parable today points us particularly to what it means to live in the realm of God is to live in the present, to live in the only place one can live. There are a couple of readings I want to begin with this morning that point us to this. One goes all the way back to the 17th century from the mathematician Blaise Pascal, and the other is from Margaret Storm Johnson, who is a British author. And these two speak words that call us to live in the only place we can live, in the present. Listen to their words. First from Pascal. He wrote, "We do not rest satisfied with the present. We anticipate that future as too slow in coming, as if in order to hasten its course, or we recall the past to stop its too rapid flight. So imprudent are we that we dream of those times which are no more and thoughtlessly overlook that which alone exists. For the present is generally painful to us. We conceal it from our sight because it troubles us. And if it be delightful to us, we regret to see it pass away. We try to sustain it by the future and think of rearranging matters which are not in our power for a time which we have no certainty of reaching. Let each one examine his thoughts, and he will find them all occupied with the past and the future. We scarcely ever think of the present, and if we think of it, it's only to take light from it to arrange the future. The present is never our end. So we never live, but we hope to live. And as we are always preparing to be happy, it's inevitable that we should never be so." And then from Margaret Storm Jameson. She expressed the view that we all spend too much time living in the past, feeling regret, and when our minds turn to the future, she said, we spend an inordinate amount of time longing for it or dreading it. The only way to live, she wrote, is to accept each minute as an unrepeatable miracle. Work at your work, play at your play, shed your tears, enjoy your laughter. Now is the time of your life. Now. Jesus' parable calls us to live in that present. This is one of Jesus' parables that's called a judgment parable or a warning parable. It is a parable that arises out of a request. He's teaching to a large crowd of people, and somebody says, "Teacher, tell my brother to share the inheritance with me." So there's this argument over the inheritance. There's an estate problem here. And they're doing what people often did. They're bringing it to a rabbi, a teacher, in order for him to settle the dispute. And Jesus responded very wisely, "Who appointed me judge over you? I'm not your referee. I'm not the one to decide on this division." And then he issued a warning. And the warning was, take care, watch, be watchful, guard against any kind of covetousness. That is a yearning. The word means a yearning or a thirsting for more. Guard against that, Jesus says. Take heed. Then he tells a story. And it's a story about a man who is caught up in this kind of constant yearning or thirst for more. It's a man who has success as a farmer, and so he wants a place to store more grain, and so he builds more barns to store his grain. But pay attention to the words in that parable, and you see that there are details in there that may be lost on us that Jesus' hearers would have noticed immediately. This man, first of all, addresses himself. He says to himself, or he thinks, it says in some translations. And then what he thinks is, well, I have all this grain. What am I going to do with all of this? And then he says to himself, soul, you will build bigger and better barns. And then someday when all the grain is in the barns, then, soul, you will be able to relax and enjoy life, and you'll be able to eat, drink, and be merry. You can take your ease. Now we think of that, well, he's talking to himself, and that's, we do that, or he's just thinking to himself. But for Jesus' hearers in that particular time and place, it would be a cue to something about his relationships, actually. Because anyone making a major decision like that would consult with friends and would consult with family members and would consult even with the elders in the village before making such a decision. But he consults only with himself. Is it because he has no family, or perhaps it's because his family doesn't matter enough to consult with any of them? Does he have friends? We don't know, but he's not consulting anyone but himself. That would have stood out for Jesus' hearers. He talked to himself. And he has this great plan, and it's all future-oriented. You hear the words? I will say to my soul, soul, take your ease, for you have plenty stored to last. So eat, drink, and be merry. Then Jesus says, God speaks to him, you fool. You fool. He's foolish. You fool. Tonight your soul will be required of you, and then whose will all this be? Now again, the word that's translated to be required is a technical term. It's often used in the Greek in relation to loans. What Jesus is saying, that God is saying in this parable, is the loan is due. What he's communicating is life is loaned to us. All that we have is on loan for us to use, and to use carefully and prudently in a way that leads to life. And certainly that is part of the meaning of Jesus' parable here. I read a few weeks ago about a young man who at age 28 developed a headache, a father of 3. The headache wouldn't go away, and then he developed vision problems, and then he had trouble walking. It was obviously very serious. He went to the doctor. They diagnosed a tumor, a brain tumor, and the doctor said that it would require surgery, and after surgery would be a long series of treatments and recovery, and if he survived that first year, his chances would be very good. And so this interview took place after that year had passed, and he was doing well. And the interviewer asked him the question, what have you learned from this? And he said, what I've learned is that life is on loan. That's what Jesus is saying in this parable. Life is on loan, he said. And he said, beyond that, we have learned as a family not to take for granted any day. to live life in the present, he said. We have learned to pay attention to each other. We've learned to spend time together. We've learned that tomorrow is uncertain and life is on loan. That is the message of Jesus' parable. And on this Father's Day, as I think about all of those men who have had a big influence on my life, those who have been mentors to me, those who have encouraged me along the way, they're all people who took the time in the present, in the midst of busyness, to be present with me and to be present with others who needed them at that moment. Father's Day for me is always a time of celebration on the one hand, and it's a time of introspection on the other. It is a time when I am challenged by all of those role models to think about whether or not I live life in the only place that it can be lived, in the present, as a father and a grandfather. Am I present? Am I really present? That for me is a challenging question. And I celebrate those who have demonstrated what it means to live in the only place we can live. Because we can get caught up in so much busyness or in so much planning for the future and looking forward to something out there, to retirement or to the next job or whatever it is. Or we want to acquire that or acquire this, and then when we get there, then we can live. You hear the words from Jesus' parable? Then, when all the barns are built and the grain is stored, then I can live. But that future never comes for that man. He's foolish for one reason. He fails to live in the only place you can live, in the present. I think about a story that Fred Craddock, one of my favorite preachers, and he was a preaching professor, he's now deceased, at Emory University, Candler School of Theology, great storyteller. And he said that one time he was in Cincinnati visiting a family, and the husband and wife were in the kitchen. He was alone in the living room with their greyhound, the family dog. And he said, so I said to the dog, so I understand you used to race and you're retired. And the dog said, is that what they told you? Because, yeah, it's true. I raced for 10 years down in Florida. I chased this rabbit around the track. And then one day, after 10 years of that, I got close enough to see that the rabbit was a fake. And it occurred to me I had spent 10 years chasing a fake rabbit. And so I didn't retire, I quit, he said. And oddly, Fred Craddock swears that's a true story. And it is a true story, isn't it? Because it's a parable. It says something about the life that we might choose to lead, and one that ultimately leads really to nowhere. Chasing that which is not really real, that which never materializes, chasing some future, some desire out there, and failing to live in the only place life can be lived, in the present. It's easy to get into that. When I think about those men that I celebrate today, it's especially those who have taken the time to live in the present. Doesn't mean they don't plan or they don't learn from the past, but they're present when they need to be present, because that's where life is lived. There's an old story about a man who went on an African safari, and this was back in the day when they used porters to carry all of the equipment and the supplies, the guns and all of that, the tents. And they're making their way on this jungle trail, and he is not satisfied with the pace. He wants to get there in a hurry, and so he's constantly pushing. On the third day, when it's time to leave, they don't leave. Everyone sits. And he says to the guide, we got to get going. Let's get going. God said, we're not going anywhere right now. Well, why? Time's wasting. We need to go. God said, we're not going anywhere. You don't understand. It's our understanding that when we push and move that fast, we have to stop and allow our souls to catch up with our bodies. That's a fascinating concept, isn't it? That's kind of a parable to me, to stop and to be present and to allow my soul to catch up to my body, because there are those times when I'm pushing full steam ahead and I'm thinking about the next thing and the next thing, and then I realize my soul is back there somewhere, and I got to let it catch up and be present, because again, that's where life is lived. I remember when Susan and I married, my mother sat us down and she said, don't spend all of your energy looking to the future, saving for the future, looking toward the next thing, toward retirement, because, she said, it may never come. She was speaking from experience. My father died when I was 16. And she knew that the present is where life is lived. I've always been challenged by that. One man was talking about going on an outing with his family, and they were rushing and rushing to get to the next activity on this family outing. I mean, even on an outing, he said, we were rushing, and their little girl, her name's Molly, their little girl wanted to stop and pick a dandelion and blow the seeds off the dandelion. You know how kids love to do. And her mother said, Molly, we don't have time to blow dandelions. And Molly, he said, looked at her and said, what is time for? That's a good question. If you don't have time to stop and blow dandelions, if you don't have time to stop on a family outing and be present, then it's time to think about that. I find this parable, I find this whole concept to be challenging. And I don't think it's just challenging for me. I'm guessing it's challenging for most of the people in this room to live in the present. Because the present is the only place to live. One named Julie Baines wrote of working on her computer in the corner of the family room. She was hunched over writing. She is a writer, working hard. She said across the room sat her 9-year-old son, who said to her across the room, hey, Mom, if you got a dog and you worked real hard to feed the dog and give the dog the best food, and you worked hard to have the money to pay the vet bills for the dog, and you bought the dog the best dog house, wouldn't it be a good idea to play with the dog every now and then? She got the message. Be present with me, he was saying. Live now. Well, as I think about that, I cannot but think of a man named Henry Bice. I know I've mentioned Henry before in my sermons. He was like a father to me. I was his pastor, but he was my mentor. And what a great guy he was. But he was always present somehow. I never saw Henry in a real hurry. He was busy, but he wasn't in a hurry. I'm not quite sure how he pulled that off. But he was always present. To the extent that our kids picked up on it. Our daughter Katie saw Henry out behind our house working on the house. The house was a church-owned parsonage. He was a member of the church. And Katie, who was 2 years old, looked out and saw Henry and said, oh, there's Henry. He's so beautiful. Well, not to look at Henry. He was all right, I guess. But that's not what she was talking about. He was beautiful because he lived where life is lived. He was present. In Pueblo, Colorado, there's a school, and I'll close with this, named after a man named George Willis Spann. Pop Spann is what everybody called him. He worked for the school for 34 years. He was the maintenance man. He was the caretaker. He was busy. But he never failed to stop and ask how folks were doing. He never failed to learn the students' names year after year. If a student couldn't afford school supplies, Pop Span would, out of his own money and with no one knowing, would purchase those supplies. He kept in contact with the teachers to find out what needs he could help with. He knew people's life stories. He knew them by name. He was present. They named a school after him, after his death, and they, in talking about him in the announcement of the naming of the school, they said, he was a man who lived life while he made a living. You hear it? I want to be a man that lives life while I make a living. Jesus called us to be present, to live in this place, and to be present to one another. And that's my prayer for you and for me. Amen.